shadow and echo. Rain drummed against the windows of the black sedan like thousands of tiny fingers begging for entry. Yet, the silence inside was far heavier than the storm outside. On the back seat, between them lay not just a physical distance, but a void as deep as an impassable ocean. Elinor had fixed her gaze on the fogged glass. The wedding dress she wore no longer felt like a garment of celebration, but like heavy armor, perhaps even an elegant shroud. Every fold of the fabric carried the weight of the suffocating moment experienced hours ago. The whispers in the church aisle, the sudden emptiness she felt as she left her father's arm, and above all, the icy indifference in the eyes of the man waiting at the altar, her childhood hero, Adrian. Adrian sat in the seat beside her, a flawless statue. There wasn't a single wrinkle in his tuxedo. His posture resembled a marble column that had stood there for centuries. His gaze was fixed forward, on the back of the chauffeur's neck. But his mind was likely miles away, on a business deal Elinor's existence couldn't reach, or among the ghosts of the past. This marriage was not a declaration of love, but a merger of two powerful families, two massive fortunes. For Adrian, it was a signature, a duty. For Elinor, it was the shattering of a childhood dream against a brutal reality. When the car turned onto the long gravel driveway guarded by ancient oak trees, the sound of stones beneath the tires cut through the silence like a knife. North Manor rose from the darkness like a massive beast. The yellow lights leaking from the Gothic windows emphasized the emptiness inside, rather than offering warmth. The car stopped. The chauffeur opened the door. The damp night air rushed in, and Elinor felt breath enter her lungs for the first time. Adrian stepped out, but he did not offer his hand. He simply straightened his jacket and walked toward the steps. Elinor, gathering her heavy skirts, followed him. This would be the first and most defining rule of their marriage. He would lead, and she would follow as his shadow. The grand entrance hall was like a vast cavern where footsteps echoed. The servants were lined up in a single row, heads bowed. There were no words of welcome, only obedient silence. Adrian headed for the stairs, touched the cold wood of the banister, and paused. Without turning his head back toward Elinor, he spoke. His voice was like the sound of metal echoing in a void. Emotionless, flat, and sharp. Just a brief instruction stating where her room was and the time for breakfast. Then he continued up the stairs, until his shadow stretched and vanished on the steps. Elinor remained alone in the middle of the hall, beneath the crystal chandelier. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The old sparkle in her eyes, that childlike hope, had been replaced by a matte resignation. This palace was not her home. It was her prison. And the warden was the man she had loved all her life. Weeks melted away in identical shades of gray. Days were lost in the high-ceilinged rooms of North Manor, amidst the ticking of the clock. Elinor quickly learned the rules of this new world. Be invisible, be flawless, and never, ever demand anything. Breakfasts were the day's most torturous ritual. At one end of the long mahogany table sat Adrian. At the other, Elinor. The distance between them was so great that even a whisper wouldn't reach the other side. Adrian read his newspaper, making no sound other than the clinking of silver cutlery. Elinor played with the food on her plate, struggling to swallow past the lump in her throat. The household staff called her Madam, but she sensed the subtle mockery in their tones. She was a mismatched piece added later to this aristocratic world. She may have carried noble blood, but she lacked the cold elegance, the calculated ruthlessness that Adrian's world required. She was a girl who lived by her emotions, who laughed, who cried, or at least she used to be. Now, with every realization that she could not melt the glaciers in Adrian's gaze, she buried those emotions a little deeper. Social gatherings were an entirely different test. The city's elite would gather in ballrooms amidst the clinking of crystal glasses. When Elinor entered the hall on Adrian's arm, draped in expensive silks and jewels, she felt the weight of the stairs. Women whispered behind their fans. Men assessed Adrian's new accessory. One evening, at a grand winter ball, Elinor overheard a group of women talking. She stood behind a large pillar, holding her breath. "Poor girl," one said, with a tone of fake pity. "The way Adrian looks at her. It's as if he bought a vase and didn't like the color." The other giggled. "Adrian never gives his heart. Especially to someone so faint. So ordinary. He merely acquired a wife suitable for his surname. He'll soon forget her completely and return to his old life." Elinor's hands began to tremble. She gripped her champagne glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes sought Adrian at the other end of the hall. Her husband was speaking with a group of businessmen. On his face was that rare, self-assured, slightly arrogant smile he saved only for his rivals in the business world. He hadn't looked at Elinor once. Throughout the night, he hadn't acknowledged her existence a single time. In that moment, something broke inside Elinor. But this break wasn't loud, like shattering glass. It was more like the silent snapping of a dry branch. The pain gave way to a deep, numbing coldness. The tears retreated. The flickering light of hope in her heart went out. She didn't cry. She didn't run out of the hall. Instead, she lifted her chin, took a deep breath, and decided for the first time that night to truly become someone. But not for Adrian, not for them. Just to keep from disappearing into this void. The change didn't happen overnight. As the seasons shifted in the window panes, Elinor changed too, slowly, layer by layer. First, she changed her wardrobe. Those flowing, pastel-colored, romantic dresses were banished to the attic. In their place came sharp-lined, dark-colored designs that wrapped her body like armor. Black velvets, midnight blue silks, blood-red satins, She began to pull her hair, those soft waves, into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Her face no longer hid behind her hair. Her cheekbones, her pale skin, and her deepening eyes were on display. Her makeup changed. Her lips became more defined, her gaze sharper. The timid girl waiting for Adrian's attention at the breakfast table was gone. Elinor rose early in the mornings, donned her riding gear, and galloped for hours on her black horse across the manor grounds. The wind hitting her face, feeling the power beneath the horse's muscles, gave her back the control she had lost. When she returned home, her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were filled with a wild glint. She used to be afraid to enter Adrian's library. Now, she had made it her sanctuary, but not just to read. She sat at the piano. She didn't play the cheerful melodies she learned as a child. She played the stormiest, darkest pieces of Rachmaninoff and Chopin. Every strike on the keys was an expression of the anger, passion, and suppressed screams inside her. The music echoed off the stone walls of the house, drifting through the corridors and reaching Adrian's study. At first, Adrian ignored the sound. But over time, the violence and emotion in those melodies began to catch his attention. One evening, buried in his files in the study, the sound of the piano came stronger than ever. He put down his pen. He lifted his head and listened. The person playing could not be the quiet, faded girl he knew. There was a demand in this music, a rebellion, a battle for existence. Out of curiosity, or perhaps due to an indefinable pull he felt for the first time, he left his room. He walked silently down the hall. He stopped at the door of the drawing room. Elinor was at the piano. Her back was to him. Through the low back of her black dress, the elegant line of her spine was visible. Her shoulders rose and fell with the rhythm of the music, her hands dancing over the keys. Watching her, Adrian felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman before him was not the scared child from their wedding day. She was a storm. She was a stranger who was self-sufficient, who created her own world, and who ruled like a queen in that world. When Elinor finished the piece, the final note hung in the air. She knew Adrian was there. She had felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, but she didn't turn. She simply clasped her hands in her lap and savored the silence. She didn't wait for Adrian to come to her. She didn't wait for his approval. And this indifference shook Adrian more deeply than months of Elinor's efforts ever could. The scales had tipped. Now, Adrian was the one watching Elinor. At social gatherings, he didn't leave her aside as he used to. Instead, he observed her from afar, a glass of whiskey in hand. He studied the cold politeness she adopted while talking to others, that faint, mysterious smile at the corner of her lips. He saw the men looking at her with admiration, and the women with a mix of envy and respect. Elinor was no longer Adrian's wife. She was Elinor, a star shining with her own light, unreachable, untouchable. At one dinner, silence reigned over the table again, but this time, the silence was different. It was an electric, tense silence full of anticipation. Adrian took a sip of his wine and slowly set the glass on the table. He fixed his eyes on Elinor. Elinor continued eating without looking up. Her grip on the fork was elegant but firm, her posture upright. Adrian seemed to be memorizing every detail of her face. The shadow of her eyelashes, the slight pulse in her neck. Adrian reached his hand across the table. His fingers moved hesitantly toward Elinor's wrist. This was the first attempt at contact in months. Elinor paused. Her fork touched the plate lightly. She lifted her head and looked into Adrian's eyes. There was no fear in that look, no excitement, only a cool, questioning expression, as if looking at a stranger. When Adrian's fingers brushed Elinor's skin, a current seemed to shoot through the man. But Elinor, slowly, without malice but with definite clarity, pulled her hand back. She brought her napkin to her lips, wiped them, and placed it on the table. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was as smooth as glass. She stood up and left the room. Adrian stared at the empty chair, his hand left hanging in the air. Rejection, especially by his own wife, the woman who would have once died for a single glance from him, awakened a burning desire mixed with anger inside him. He had underestimated her. He hadn't seen her. Now he saw her, and what he saw was magnificent beyond possession. It was one of the harshest nights of winter. Outside, a blizzard battered the windows, and the wind howled in the chimneys. The manor had turned into a cold, dark fortress. Adrian couldn't concentrate in his study. His mind was constantly in the room upstairs, with Elinor. The restlessness inside made it impossible for him to sit still. His logic, his pride, told him to stop. But his instincts, that primal attraction he had suppressed and ignored for months, led him to the stairs. He paused when he reached the door of Elinor's bedroom. The door was ajar. The crackle of the fireplace and a dim light seeped from within. Adrian pushed the door slowly. Elinor was sitting in the armchair in front of the fireplace. She wore a satin robe. She had let the book in her hand drop to her lap and was watching the fire. The crimson reflection of the flames danced on her face. She was so beautiful, so alone, and so whole. Adrian entered. His steps on the carpet were silent, but Elinor felt his presence. She didn't turn. She just continued to watch the fire. Adrian came up behind the armchair. He reached out and touched Elinor's shoulder over the robe. Elinor didn't flinch. She just took a deep breath. "Why are you here, Adrian?" she asked. Her voice was like a whisper, yet stronger than the storm in the room. Adrian sank to his knees, bringing his face level with hers. There was an expression in his eyes never seen before. Desperation, regret, and raw, naked desire. "I see you," Adrian said. His voice trembled. "I truly see you, Elinor. For months, I was blind, but now, wherever I look, there you are. And that piano music, and your perfume in the hallway, in every corner of this house." Elinor slowly turned her head. Her eyes met Adrian's. Adrian searched those eyes for forgiveness, for a softening. He brought his hand to Elinor's cheek. He stroked her cheekbone with his thumb. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Give me a chance. Let's start over. This time, for real." Adrian leaned in, moving to kiss her. This kiss would be an apology, a seal, a beginning. However, just as their lips were about to touch, Elinor turned her head slightly to the side. Adrian's lips brushed her cheek. A deadly silence fell over the room. Only the crackling of the logs in the fireplace could be heard. Elinor stood up. Adrian remained kneeling on the floor, as if he had fallen into a void. Elinor walked to the window. She looked out at the storm. In her reflection in the glass, she could see her husband kneeling behind her, devastated. "Adrian," she said, facing the glass. "It's too late." She turned and looked at him. There was neither hatred nor anger in her face, only a sad wisdom. "I killed that girl," she said. "The girl who waited for your approval, who thought she could exist through your love. I killed her in these rooms, at those silent dinner tables. You killed her. And now, you are falling in love with that girl's ghost. But I am not her anymore." Adrian stood up, reaching his hands toward her. "No, I want you. The you right now." Elinor shook her head. A tear appeared in her eye, but she didn't let it fall. "You don't want me, Adrian. You want what no longer belongs to you. You love the unreachable. I was a statue to you, then a shadow, and now an object of desire. But I will never again be your home." Elinor pointed to the bedroom door, a silent, absolute command. Adrian froze where he stood. He was being torn apart in the war between duty and desire, regret and pride. He looked at the woman before him, his wife, and for the first time, he understood that he had truly lost. He had to leave, not to win her over, but because he knew he didn't deserve her. He bowed his head. Like a defeated king, shoulders slumped, he walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, wanting to look back one last time, but he didn't. He closed the door gently behind him. Elinor was left alone in the room again. The fire in the fireplace was dying down. She turned to the window, placing her hand on the cold glass. Outside, the storm was subsiding, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. She was alone. But this loneliness was not abandonment. This was a majestic, untouchable solitude she had chosen and built herself. She took a deep breath. The void inside her might not have been filled, but she was now the owner of that void. And that was stronger than any kind of love. In the darkness, for the first time, she truly smiled.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story.